Craig Boone, a man whose life would become irrevocably intertwined with the unforgiving sands of the Mojave Wasteland, began his existence in the pre-war territories of what would later be consolidated under the new California Republic, a sprawling government whose ideals of democracy and expansionism shaped the lives of countless citizens and soldiers alike. Born into a society increasingly defined by technological ambition, militarization, and corporate influence, Boone's early years were marked by the complex interplay of civic pride and latent anxieties about the growing instability of the American West, where the values instilled in young men like him would soon be tested by the harsh realities of conflict and survival, and where his earliest memories of family, community, and the encroaching presence of the military-industrial state would begin to form a foundation for the man he would become. His youth was punctuated by both ordinary experiences, attending school, participating in local civic activities, and observing the daily rhythms of small-town life, and by subtle indications that the world he inhabited was teetering on the brink of monumental change, a tension that would later inform his acute sense of duty, loyalty, and moral rigor, qualities that would come to define his military career and his complex interactions with the wasteland he would inhabit after the Great War. Boone's formative environment, influenced by the traditions of Californian frontier society, the emerging technological innovations of the mid-21st century, and the broader geopolitical anxieties of a world edging toward nuclear confrontation, shaped both his practical skills and his philosophical outlook, fostering in him an early awareness of the fragility of civilization and the importance of measured action, foresight, and responsibility, all traits that would later define his approach to conflict both on the battlefield and in the morally ambiguous landscape of the post-apocalyptic Mojave. As Boone approached adolescence, his aptitude for precision, patience, and observation became increasingly evident, qualities that naturally lent themselves to the discipline of marksmanship, and would later define his reputation as one of the NCR's most formidable snipers. His training, initially informal and guided by local mentors and military instructors, was complemented by a rigorous engagement with the theoretical aspects of warfare, tactical decision-making, and survival skills that would prove essential in the unforgiving environments he would later traverse. The young Boone exhibited a meticulous attention to detail, a capacity for quiet reflection, and an innate understanding of strategic positioning, all of which set him apart from his peers and signaled the emergence of a soldier whose prowess would not merely be measured by physical skill, but by mental acuity and the ethical discernment that would later inform his difficult choices. Beyond skill development, Boone's adolescent years were shaped by observations of national and regional politics, the expansionist policies of the NCR, and the increasing tension between governmental authority and the marginalized populations of the American Southwest, a context that cultivated in him a nuanced understanding of duty, obedience, and the sometimes painful divergence between personal morality and institutional orders, elements that would later haunt him following the events of Bitter Springs, and influence his interactions with both allies and adversaries in the Mojave Wasteland. The culmination of Boone's formative experiences, marked by his early exposure to military discipline, personal loss, and the moral complexities of governance, prepared him for enlistment in the new California Republic Army, an institution that demanded both unwavering loyalty and the ability to navigate ethically challenging situations under extreme pressure. The synthesis of his upbringing, inherent skill set, and early moral education provided Boone with the capacity to excel as a soldier while maintaining a reflective awareness of the broader implications of his actions, an awareness that would later manifest in profound personal conflict following his direct involvement in the Bitter Springs massacre and in his ongoing struggle to reconcile the ideals of honor and justice with the sometimes brutal necessities imposed by wartime realities. Even before stepping into the Mojave Wasteland, Boone's character had been shaped by the interplay of external pressures, internal convictions, and the subtle yet persistent lessons of his youth, creating a foundation for a man whose narrative would intertwine irrevocably with themes of loss, redemption, loyalty, and the relentless search for moral clarity amidst the ashes of a world forever changed by nuclear devastation, setting the stage for the complex, multifaceted persona that players encounter when they meet him at Novak, a sniper whose precision is matched only by the weight of his conscience and the depth of his enduring grief. His formal enlistment in the new California Republic Army represented not merely a career decision, but a profound transformation in his identity, shifting him from the life of a civilian shaped by the fading norms of pre-war society into the rigorously disciplined existence of a professional soldier whose every thought, movement, and choice would soon be guided by the rules, hierarchy, and philosophy of a burgeoning military power seeking to impose order across the Mojave and beyond. From the very first day of basic training, Boone exhibited traits that set him apart from his peers: a measured patience in all tasks, a focused intensity during marksmanship drills, and an almost obsessive attention to tactical detail that impressed instructors and created the early reputation of a soldier whose abilities were matched by an ethical clarity that would remain, paradoxically, both his greatest asset and his deepest burden. While many recruits viewed training as a mere series of physical and procedural exercises, Boone approached each element with a combination of intellectual curiosity and moral awareness, analyzing not only the mechanics of firing a rifle or coordinating with a squad, but also the consequences of each action in the broader context of the NCR's goals and the lives of civilians in contested territories. His education in the Army went far beyond mere combat skills. It included intensive instruction in reconnaissance, map reading, survival tactics, and the principles of small unit leadership, all of which were designed to cultivate soldiers who could execute orders with precision while maintaining initiative in unpredictable environments. A requirement that Boone fulfilled with a quiet but undeniable excellence. In this period, he also became acutely aware of the political dimensions of military service, observing the ways in which the NCR's expansionist policies interacted with local populations, tribal communities, and the emergent power structures of the post-war American Southwest. An awareness that would later influence his moral judgments in field operations and his eventual disillusionment following events such as the Bitter Springs massacre. Boone's instructors quickly noted that he possessed a rare combination of physical skill, intellectual capacity, and ethical reflection, traits that often placed him in positions of informal leadership even before he officially received rank or command, and that would later distinguish him as one of the NCR's most respected snipers and tacticians, capable of executing high-stakes missions with minimal guidance, while never losing sight of the human cost of his actions. Beyond the structured environment of the barracks and training fields, Boone's personality and moral framework were further shaped by interactions with fellow soldiers, many of whom were drawn from families with long histories of NCR service, or from frontier communities still grappling with the legacies of the Great War. These relationships reinforced his sense of loyalty and camaraderie, even as they exposed him to differing perspectives on duty, justice, and the sometimes arbitrary exercise of authority, experiences that would leave a lasting impression on the man he was becoming. The rigorous physical training demanded not only endurance and strength, but also mental discipline, a combination that Boone mastered with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, often taking extra time to perfect shooting techniques, fieldcraft, and long-range reconnaissance skills in solitude, demonstrating a commitment to excellence that earned him both admiration and occasional envy among peers. As his proficiency grew, Boone was selected for advanced sniper training, a specialized course that refined his abilities in precision shooting, camouflage, stalking, and battlefield observation, all skills that would later define his lethal efficiency and tactical foresight in the Mojave campaigns. The curriculum was designed to produce marksmen capable of operating independently, making life-or-death decisions under extreme stress, and contributing strategically to larger military objectives without direct supervision, a challenge that Boone met with meticulous care and an almost ritualistic dedication to practice, reflecting his deep respect for both the craft of warfare and the responsibility inherent in wielding lethal force. During these formative months, Boone also began developing the psychological resilience that would characterize his later career, confronting the realities of killing, the moral ambiguities of military obedience, and the ethical dilemmas posed by collateral damage in populated areas, a reflection of his early philosophical engagement with duty and justice, and a precursor to the profound moral crises that would haunt him after his direct involvement in the Bitter Springs incident. The NCR Army instilled in him a sense of purpose, discipline, and belonging. Yet Boone's reflective nature meant that every exercise, mission, and instruction was evaluated through the lens of his personal ethics, creating an internal dialogue between loyalty to orders and responsibility to his conscience, a duality that would become central to his character and narrative in the Mojave Wasteland. Even as he excelled in training, Boone remained acutely aware of the broader strategic objectives of the NCR, understanding that his role as a soldier, and eventually as a sniper, was not only to neutralize enemies, but also to maintain stability, enforce NCR policy, and contribute to the fragile order emerging across contested territories, knowledge that informed his careful deliberation and cautious approach to operational planning. The combination of skill, intelligence, and ethical sensitivity allowed Boone to progress rapidly through the ranks of enlisted men, earning commendations for marksmanship, reconnaissance, acumen, and battlefield judgment, while simultaneously cultivating an internal standard of conduct that often exceeded the formal expectations of his superiors, demonstrating an uncommon integration of professional competence and moral consideration. Boone's early deployment experiences, including exercises in the arid desert and simulated conflict zones, tested both his physical endurance and his capacity for ethical judgment, forcing him to navigate scenarios where civilian populations, local tribal dynamics, and NCR military objectives intersected in ways that were rarely clear-cut, experiences that laid the groundwork for his later conscientious responses to the Mojave's complex moral landscape. By the conclusion of his initial training and early service assignments, Boone had established a reputation as a soldier of exceptional skill, remarkable precision, and profound ethical awareness, a combination that made him both a highly effective combatant and a reflective, morally engaged participant in the larger NCR enterprise, setting the stage for his future assignments, the challenges he would face in Bitter Springs, and the enduring internal struggles that would define the man players ultimately encounter in Novak, a sniper whose abilities were matched only by the depth of his conscience and the weight of his emerging sense of justice. The desert campaigns of Craig Boone's early military career in the new California Republic Army represented both a crucible of professional development and a formative journey into the moral and psychological dimensions of warfare, as the Mojave Desert, with its arid expanses, treacherous terrain, and fragmented populations, became the environment in which Boone honed the skills, discipline, and strategic understanding that would later define him as one of the NCR's most precise and conscientious snipers, assigned to multiple reconnaissance and patrol units tasked with securing NCR interests across contested territories. Boone's missions demanded not only exceptional marksmanship, but also the capacity to read the landscape, anticipate enemy movements, and make life-or-death decisions with minimal supervision, a combination of tactical skill and ethical discernment that increasingly distinguished him from his peers and impressed his commanding officers. The desert campaigns were characterized by harsh environmental conditions that tested the endurance and adaptability of all soldiers. Yet Boone's meticulous preparation, attention to detail, and patient observation allowed him to thrive where others struggled. He learned to identify subtle variations in the terrain that signaled potential ambushes, water sources, or enemy encampments, developing an almost intuitive understanding of how to use the environment to both protect his unit and gain tactical advantage. Beyond the physical and tactical challenges, these campaigns also exposed Boone to the political and humanitarian complexities of NCR operations, as the territories he patrolled were home to a mixture of refugee settlements, tribal communities, and displaced populations, struggling to survive amidst the shifting balance of power, requiring him to weigh the strict application of military orders against the potential consequences for non-combatants. A dilemma that would leave a lasting imprint on his conscience and inform his later moral reflections. Boone witnessed firsthand the tensions between NCR expansionist objectives and local populations, including tribal groups who resisted incorporation into the Republic, raider bands preying on settlements, and independent communities navigating the vacuum left by the pre-war collapse of centralized authority. These interactions revealed the fragility of order, the limitations of military enforcement, and the often unintended consequences of armed intervention, lessons that Boone internalized as part of his growing understanding of the ethical weight carried by soldiers operating in morally ambiguous environments. During the campaigns, Boone's exceptional skill with long-range firearms became increasingly indispensable, allowing him to neutralize threats from a distance with minimal collateral damage, yet he also observed the devastating consequences when errors occurred, or when less disciplined soldiers acted without forethought, reinforcing his commitment to precision, patience, and responsibility in every engagement. The desert's harshness also demanded proficiency in survival, navigation, and resource management. Boone learned to ration supplies, identify edible plants, locate hidden water sources, and anticipate environmental hazards, all while remaining focused on mission objectives, a combination of endurance and tactical acuity that elevated him beyond the capabilities of many of his contemporaries and solidified his emerging reputation as a soldier whose expertise was inseparable from his ethical vigilance. As Boone engaged in these campaigns, he encountered multiple hostile forces, including rogue raider factions, remnants of pre-war militias, and rival NCR units, In contested operational zones, experiences that required rapid decision-making under extreme stress, and provided him with a deep appreciation for the human cost of conflict, the fragility of alliances, and the necessity of discipline, restraint, even when provoked or endangered. The Mojave campaigns were also a formative period for Boone's understanding of the interplay between leadership and accountability, as he observed the effects of poor decision-making, miscommunication, and moral compromise among commanders. Lessons that would later influence how he judged both superiors and subordinates, and shaped his evolving criteria for loyalty, honor, and the appropriate application of force. In addition, Boone's exposure to the broader logistics and strategy of the NCR's desert operations revealed the complexities of maintaining supply lines, coordinating reconnaissance, and enforcing territorial control over a region marked by contested claims, environmental hazards, and limited infrastructure, giving him insight into the institutional challenges that the Republic faced, and a nuanced perspective on the ethical dilemmas inherent in wielding military power. Throughout these campaigns, Boone's internal moral compass was continually tested, as he observed and participated in actions that, while tactically sound, carried profound human consequences. From forced evacuations to encounters with civilian populations caught between warring factions, experiences that seeded the growing tension between duty to the NCR and the imperative to act with humanity and conscience. The culmination of these desert campaigns did not merely refine Boone's technical proficiency or survival skills. It shaped the psychological and ethical framework that would govern his later decisions, instilling a heightened awareness of the responsibilities borne by those with lethal capability and a commitment to ensuring that every action, even under orders, was considered within the broader context of justice, consequence, and the potential for human suffering. By the end of his early Mojave assignments, Boone had become a soldier whose reputation for skill, ethical rigor, and tactical judgment was firmly established, a combination that made him invaluable to the NCR, yet also deeply aware of the moral ambiguities that accompanied military service, preparing him for the experiences, decisions, and crises, including the events at Bitter Springs, that would come to define his legacy and leave an indelible mark on his life, his conscience, and the story of the Mojave Wasteland itself, solidifying the complex, multifaceted character that players encounter in Novak, a sniper whose precision, discipline, and ethical awareness make him simultaneously a formidable combatant and a man wrestling with the profound consequences of his actions in a morally fractured world. The Battle of Bitter Springs stands as the defining and most tragic moment of Craig Boone's life, a crucible of moral and emotional trauma that would haunt him long after the echoes of gunfire faded and the Mojave sun cast its harsh light over the desolation, a pivotal event that illuminates both the brutality of post-war conflict and the complex ethical responsibilities of soldiers in the new California Republic Army, as Boone, a sniper already distinguished by precision, patience, and conscientious deliberation, found himself thrust into a situation where the line between duty and conscience was irrevocably blurred. The Bitter Springs engagement arose from the NCR's effort to maintain control over the Mojave Desert and assert authority over the region's disparate populations, including tribes, settlers, and nomadic groups, at a time when tensions between the expanding republic and the indigenous communities had reached a breaking point, creating conditions in which miscommunication, fear, and pre-existing prejudices would culminate in a catastrophe. whose effects resonated across the desert and into the psyche of those involved. Boone's role in the Bitter Springs operation was initially as a recon and marksman asset, tasked with providing overwatch and neutralizing hostile threats from a distance, a responsibility for which his meticulous training and disciplined temperament ideally suited him. Yet the mission quickly escalated beyond the controlled parameters anticipated by his commanding officers, as reports of skirmishes with local tribes were interpreted with a mixture of alarm, caution, and institutional bias, leading to an order that would compel soldiers under Boone's watch to act decisively against non-combatants, a reality that placed him at the center of a moral and operational maelstrom that would forever shape his personal code and worldview. The sequence of events at Bitter Springs began with the NCR's decision to preempt perceived threats from a local tribe, a choice informed by fear, misjudgment, and the Republic's overarching imperative to consolidate power in the region, which quickly escalated into a violent confrontation that saw soldiers executing orders that, while technically aligned with military objectives, resulted in the deaths of men, women, and children, a calculus that Boone internalized with profound horror as he observed firsthand the consequences of obedience devoid of ethical reflection. The massacre left an indelible impression on him, establishing a chasm between the NCR's institutional mandate and his own sense of justice, an internal conflict that would become the foundation of his later moral rigidity and enduring guilt. Throughout the engagement, Boone's precision as a sniper was unmatched, his ability to neutralize threats from great distances, ensuring that casualties among his unit were minimized, even as the surrounding chaos intensified. Yet no technical proficiency could mitigate the psychological trauma induced by witnessing the indiscriminate slaughter of innocents, a reality that instilled a profound sense of shame, responsibility, and helplessness that would define his subsequent behavior and worldview. The aftermath of Bitter Springs presented Boone with an ethical dilemma of enormous scope. The knowledge that the very organization he had pledged loyalty to had sanctioned actions he could not reconcile with his personal moral framework created a rift that manifested in his subsequent withdrawal from close interactions, his brooding introspection, and a simmering desire for justice that transcended military protocol, foreshadowing the obsessive vigilance and moral deliberation he would display in later encounters with the Mojave Wasteland's complex socio-political landscape. In the days and weeks following the massacre, Boone became acutely aware of the emotional and psychological toll exacted on all participants, observing the interplay between trauma, institutional rationalization, and human conscience, insights that deepened his understanding of both the cost of war and the imperative for personal accountability even within hierarchical command structures, shaping a personal ethos in which precision, patience, and careful deliberation were inseparable from moral responsibility. His recollections of Bitter Springs were not merely memories of combat, but lived experiences that fused technical proficiency with moral reckoning, the juxtaposition of life-saving skill and the horror of unintended consequences, creating a cognitive framework that would dictate his every decision in subsequent military operations and post-military life, influencing the way he judged both comrades and adversaries in the Mojave, and informing the ethical counsel he later offered to those who would come to rely upon him, including the Courier. Boone's trauma manifested in a series of behavioral adaptations, heightened vigilance, a meticulous adherence to rules of engagement, and a near-obsessive commitment to ensuring that his actions would never again contribute to the harm of innocents, behaviors that simultaneously reinforced his effectiveness as a soldier and deepened the isolation he experienced as he wrestled privately with the ghosts of Bitter Springs, a crucible of conscience that forged a man defined as much by his moral reckoning as by his combat skill. The Battle of Bitter Springs thus stands not merely as an historical event within the NCR's expansionist campaigns, but as the central defining moment of Boone's life, shaping his subsequent relationships, professional decisions, and philosophical perspective on duty, loyalty, and the ethical application of force, a lens through which he would view the Mojave Wasteland, the Legion, NCR politics, and every encounter in which life, death, and morality intersected. It is this interplay of skill, duty, and conscience that renders Boone a figure of profound complexity, a soldier haunted by the realities of war, yet striving toward a moral clarity that even the chaos of the wasteland cannot entirely obscure, setting the stage for his personal quest for redemption, his deep-seated mistrust of institutional authority when it conflicts with ethical imperatives, and the enduring tension between loyalty to the Republic and fidelity to the ideals of justice that guide him, all of which converge to form the character that players encounter at Novak, a sniper whose deadly precision is inseparable from the weight of conscience and the tragic burden of having witnessed the full moral cost of war in the desert sands of Bitter Springs. The period following the events at Bitter Springs represented for Craig Boone a profound and defining chapter in both his personal and professional life, a period marked by a mixture of isolation, moral reckoning, and the slow emergence of a psychological burden that would shape his every thought, decision, and interaction in the years to come, as the scars of witnessing the massacre of innocents under NCR orders forced him to confront the ethical contradictions inherent in military service and the frailty of human morality in times of conflict. Boone's withdrawal from close social interactions during this period was as much a response to trauma as it was a conscious effort to reconcile the gulf between the soldier he had been trained to become and the man who could not abide senseless violence, and it reflected the deepening of an internal moral framework in which every action, every decision, and every engagement had to be measured against an uncompromising standard of conscience and accountability, a standard that often placed him at odds with both superiors and peers who lacked the same capacity for reflection or the same acute awareness of consequence. The aftermath of Bitter Springs was not merely a psychological challenge, but a practical one. As Boone continued to fulfill his duties as a sniper and reconnaissance specialist, while simultaneously grappling with guilt, grief, and a growing skepticism of the NCR's institutional objectives, navigating a delicate balance between obedience to command and fidelity to personal ethics in missions that increasingly tested both his tactical skill and his moral judgment. This duality became a defining feature of his post-massacre life, shaping the way he interacted with subordinates, evaluated orders, and processed the unfolding realities of the Mojave Desert, where the lines between enemy and ally, right and wrong, were often blurred by circumstance, necessity, and the complexities of survival. During this period, Boone's reputation as a marksman and tactician continued to grow, yet it was now accompanied by a visible restraint, a careful deliberation in the execution of duties, and an insistence upon precision not merely as a tactical requirement, but as a moral imperative, reflecting his belief that skill in combat carried with it an unavoidable responsibility for the consequences of its application. Every shot fired, Every mission completed and every command followed became an opportunity to assert control over outcomes in a world that had previously demonstrated how quickly order could devolve into chaos and cruelty. Boone's interactions with fellow soldiers were likewise informed by this period of reflection and adjustment. As he became increasingly selective in whom he trusted, preferring comrades who exhibited both competence and conscience, while distancing himself from those whose obedience to orders appeared divorced from ethical consideration or human empathy, a behavior that further reinforced his isolation, even as it ensured that he remained a stabilizing presence in the units he supported. Beyond the immediate military environment, the post-Bitter Springs period forced Boone to confront the broader implications of NCR policy in the Mojave, as he observed the Republic's continued efforts to assert control over territories, negotiate with, or suppress, local communities, and contend with raider factions and rival forces such as Caesar's Legion, experiences that compounded his awareness of the tension between institutional duty and individual morality, and reinforced the enduring question of whether loyalty to an organization could justify participation in acts of violence that violated personal ethical standards. In addition, Boone's personal life, particularly his relationship with his wife Carla, took on renewed significance as he sought both solace and purpose outside the strictures of military life, attempting to reconcile the role of soldier and husband, protector, and moral agent in a world where violence and betrayal were never far from the surface. The contrast between his domestic life and his professional experiences provided a lens through which he could reflect on the human consequences of the Bitter Springs massacre, offering both fleeting respite and a continual reminder of what had been lost, and of the responsibilities that remained. The psychological consequences of Bitter Springs, combined with the ongoing demands of military service, created a period of intense introspection for Boone, shaping his worldview, reinforcing his commitment to ethical conduct, and heightening his sensitivity to the suffering of others, whether civilian, comrade, or enemy, an awareness that would come to define his reputation in the Mojave as both a formidable sniper and a morally conscientious soldier. During this time, he developed coping mechanisms that allowed him to maintain operational effectiveness while simultaneously grappling with guilt and grief, including meticulous preparation for missions, extreme attention to detail, and a habit of mentally rehearsing the consequences of his actions before engaging, strategies that ensured both his survival and the survival of those under his protection, while mitigating the risk of moral compromise. The period also laid the groundwork for his eventual disillusionment with the NCR, as Boone increasingly recognized the discrepancy between the Republic's stated ideals of justice, protection, and civil order, and the often harsh, violent, and morally ambiguous methods employed to achieve those goals, insights that would later fuel his cautious approach to NCR alliances in the Mojave Wasteland, and his careful evaluation of the Courier's decisions, which could align with or diverge from the ethical principles he now held paramount. Boone's post-Bitter Springs existence was thus defined by a duality of exceptional professional competence and profound personal struggle, a combination that produced a soldier whose skill with a rifle was matched only by the weight of his conscience, and whose every action was informed by the tragic lessons of a massacre that had forever altered the trajectory of his life, solidifying a narrative of responsibility, reflection, and redemption that would guide him through the subsequent campaigns of the Mojave and inform the character players encounter in Novak, a man whose loyalty, precision, and moral clarity exist in constant tension with the memory of what he could not prevent, and the ongoing pursuit of justice, both personal and universal, in a world scarred by war, chaos, and human fallibility. Craig Boone's life, marked by the trauma and moral weight of Bitter Springs, found a rare and fleeting sense of peace, with the presence of Carla Boone, his wife, whose introduction into his life represented both a sanctuary from the relentless burdens of military service and a fragile anchor to humanity amidst the chaos of the post-apocalyptic Mojave. Their meeting, though sparse in documented details, is understood within the canonical framework of Fallout New Vegas to have occurred during Boone's assignment and subsequent reassignment following Bitter Springs, a period in which he was grappling with guilt, isolation, and a profound re-evaluation of the meaning of loyalty, duty, and personal responsibility. And it is within this context that the relationship with Carla took on an existential significance, providing both emotional grounding and a mirror for the ideals he could no longer fully reconcile with the actions he had witnessed. The development of their bond was not simply a matter of companionship, but also a mutual recognition of shared vulnerability and the need for human connection in a world that offered little stability, with Carla providing the quiet yet unwavering support that allowed Boone to navigate both his internal moral conflicts and the external pressures of a republic whose policies often conflicted with his personal sense of justice. Through her presence, Boone was able to experience the dimensions of ordinary domestic life, including moments of intimacy, conversation, and shared responsibility, which contrasted starkly with the violence, uncertainty, and ethical ambiguity that had previously defined his daily existence. The significance of Carla Boone's role in Craig's life extended beyond emotional support, serving also as a stabilizing force in his psychological rehabilitation following the events of Bitter Springs, offering a space in which grief, guilt, and moral doubt could be confronted, acknowledged, and managed within the safety of interpersonal trust, a process that allowed him to maintain operational effectiveness even as he remained haunted by the past. In this sense, Carla's presence functioned as both an anchor and a lens, enabling Boone to contextualize his experiences within broader human and ethical frameworks, and to retain the capacity for reflection, compassion, and ethical engagement, even in a world defined by scarcity, violence, and moral uncertainty. Their life together, centered in Novak, became emblematic of the fragile hope that the Mojave could offer, even to those who had endured profound trauma, a domestic microcosm in which Boone could practice the values of care, attentiveness, and protection in ways that directly contradicted the destructive forces he had witnessed, and, for a time, mitigated the isolation and obsessive focus on duty that had characterized his post-Bitter Springs existence. The home they shared, though modest, and often imperiled by the encroaching dangers of the wasteland, represented both a literal and symbolic safe haven, a locus of emotional restoration in which the principles of reciprocity, trust, and intimacy could be enacted in the absence of immediate threat, yet always under the looming shadow of a violent, unpredictable world outside the walls of their domestic sphere. Within this context, Boone's relationship with Carla also influenced his moral and tactical decision-making, as the presence of someone he loved and sought to protect heightened his awareness of consequences, sharpened his attention to detail, and reinforced his commitment to minimizing unnecessary harm in all engagements, a behavioral pattern that would later manifest in interactions with the Courier and the ethical calculus applied in choosing how to confront both Legion and NCR forces, as well as neutral parties within the Mojave. Carla's influence, while subtle in the broader narrative of Boone's life, is critical in understanding the integration of personal, ethics, and relational responsibility into the framework of his soldiering, shaping both the man he became and the lens through which he assessed the morality of others. The canonical record also emphasizes the fragility inherent in this period of Boone's life, as his attachment to Carla underscored the precariousness of personal connections in a post-apocalyptic environment, a vulnerability that would later be exploited and realized with devastating consequences following her abduction, highlighting the interdependence of emotional well-being and ethical vigilance, as well as the persistent tension between personal desires and the harsh realities of survival. This dynamic illustrates the extent to which Boone's character is defined not solely by his military training or moral philosophy, but also by the human capacity for attachment, loss, and grief, which intertwines inseparably with his narrative arc in the Mojave Wasteland. Boone's experience of domestic life with Carla, however brief and ultimately tragic, provided a counterpoint to the pervasive violence and moral compromise of his military and post-military experiences, demonstrating that even in a world ravaged by nuclear devastation and human cruelty, the potential for relational stability, care, and ethical engagement remained, albeit tenuously, and could profoundly shape the psychological resilience and moral decision-making of those who experienced it. The presence of Carla Boone in Craig's life thus becomes a lens through which to understand both his ethical framework and his enduring capacity for empathy, offering insight into how the interplay between personal relationships and the obligations of duty informed his subsequent choices, actions, and ultimate trajectory within the Mojave. In essence, the meeting and subsequent life shared with Carla Boone represents a critical chapter in Craig Boone's journey, encapsulating the delicate balance between human connection, ethical integrity, and the inescapable consequences of past trauma, serving as both a source of solace and a prelude to the profound challenges that would test the limits of his moral resolve, define his enduring legacy within the Mojave, and illuminate the intricate interplay between love, duty, and conscience in the life of one of the new California Republic Army's most skilled and morally conscientious soldiers, a narrative thread that resonates throughout the Fallout New Vegas canon and offers players an understanding of Boone as a character whose humanity and complexity are inseparable from both his past suffering and the relational bonds that provided fleeting respite from it. The disappearance of Carla Boone represents one of the most pivotal and emotionally devastating moments in the life of Craig Boone, a juncture that crystallized the intersection of personal loss, moral reckoning, and the relentless demands of survival in the Mojave Wasteland, a reality that not only tested the limits of his endurance, but also shaped the trajectory of his psychological and ethical framework in profound ways. As the abduction occurred within the broader context of the volatile socio-political environment of the post-apocalyptic Southwest, where raider factions, the encroaching influence of Caesar's Legion, and the delicate maneuverings of the new California Republic combined to create a landscape in which personal security was always tenuous, and the consequences of inattention often catastrophic, Boone's discovery of Carla's disappearance transformed his domestic sanctuary into a site of anguish and urgency, as the life he had painstakingly cultivated, characterized by moral reflection, relational care, and fragile stability, was abruptly rendered precarious. exposing the vulnerability inherent in attachments formed amid the chaos of a world defined by scarcity, violence, and moral ambiguity. The canonical account situates Carla's abduction within the larger pattern of Mojave unrest, highlighting the strategic and often opportunistic nature of raider activity, which targeted not only resources and supplies, but also vulnerable individuals whose capture could exert leverage over more powerful actors. In this case, transforming Boone from a soldier grappling with moral dilemmas into a man compelled by personal vengeance, protection, and a desperate need for resolution, illustrating the extent to which the Mojave's social and political instability could impinge upon private life and catalyze profound psychological and ethical responses. Boone's reaction to Carla's disappearance was immediate, intense, and shaped by the dual imperatives of tactical precision and personal loyalty. The training and discipline instilled during his years in the NCR Army, combined with the reflective, conscientious approach honed through the trauma of Bitter Springs, informed his methodical search strategies, his careful assessment of potential threats, and his meticulous prioritization of information, leading him to undertake an exhaustive investigation of local settlements, patrol routes, and known raider hideouts, all while grappling with an internal maelstrom of grief, guilt, and ethical conflict regarding the decisions he had made and the consequences of the broader institutional forces at play. This period of searching and strategizing was marked by profound moral tension, as Boone navigated the line between vengeance and justice, measured response and emotional reactivity, striving to ensure that his actions, even in pursuit of personal closure, would remain aligned with the ethical principles that had increasingly defined him since the events at Bitter Springs, yet always aware that the Mojave's harsh realities might compel decisions that conflicted with these ideals. It was within this crucible of necessity, moral deliberation, and emotional urgency that Boone's character was further refined, cementing the duality of his identity as both a lethal marksman and a man profoundly shaped by conscience, loss, and love. The disappearance of Carla Boone also had significant tactical implications, as it forced Boone to operate independently of NCR support, relying solely on his skills in reconnaissance, marksmanship, and environmental observation, as well as on his knowledge of human behavior, threat assessment, and the psychology of potential abductors, creating a situation in which his operational capacity was inextricably linked to his emotional stakes, thereby intensifying the cognitive and moral pressures he faced. Each decision carried heightened significance, as failure could not only result in the loss of Carla, but also undermine Boone's own sense of integrity and self-efficacy, a pressure that simultaneously sharpened his effectiveness and deepened his internal struggle. Canonical sources further suggest that Boone's search for Carla involved navigating a complex web of Mojave factions, each with their own interests, alliances, and threats, including the Legion, local raider gangs, and NCR patrols, a network in which misinformation, territorial disputes, and opportunistic violence created an environment of uncertainty in which every lead required careful evaluation, every movement was potentially fraught with danger, and every decision bore both tactical and moral weight, reinforcing the extent to which Boone's personal quest was inseparable from the broader socio-political dynamics of the Mojave. Psychologically, the disappearance acted as both a catalyst and a crucible, compelling Boone to confront unresolved grief from Bitter Springs, integrate the lessons of moral accountability he had learned in the NCR, and reconcile the human need for attachment, with the imperatives of survival and strategic reasoning, all while maintaining a focus on actionable intelligence and ethical decision-making. A synthesis of personal and professional imperatives that highlights the unique complexity of his character within the Fallout New Vegas canon. The narrative of Carla's disappearance thus functions as a lens through which to understand Boone's subsequent choices, behavior, and interactions with the Courier and other characters, revealing a man whose professional competence is inseparable from the profound emotional and ethical weight he carries, whose lethal precision is tempered by conscience, and whose personal loss drives both vigilance and a measured, morally informed approach to conflict, illustrating the interdependence of skill, morality, and relational attachment in the shaping of a fully realized character within the post-apocalyptic Mojave, a sniper whose humanity is defined as much by the absence of what he has lost as by the capabilities that make him formidable. In sum, the disappearance of Carla Boone is not merely an isolated personal tragedy, but a catalytic event in the canonical narrative of Craig Boone, establishing the parameters of his moral universe, intensifying the psychological consequences of prior trauma, and serving as the driving force behind his later decisions, allegiances, and ethical stances, a defining moment that explains the depth of his grief, the rigor of his moral reasoning, and the enduring complexity of his character, situating him as a profoundly human figure in the Mojave, whose story intertwines loss, love, duty, and conscience in ways that resonate throughout the narrative and illuminate the stakes, both personal and ethical, of survival in a world defined by scarcity, violence, and the consequences of human choice. The period known to residents of Novac as the Man in the Dinky represents the apex of Craig Boone's psychological isolation, a stage in which grief, survivor's guilt, and an obsessive preoccupation with justice converge to define not only his daily routines, but also his very perception of the Mojave Wasteland and the moral responsibilities he carried as both a soldier and a man broken by circumstance. Following the abduction of Carla Boone and the traumatic events at Bitter Springs, Boone retreated into the skeletal remains of the Novac dinosaur, a location he transformed from an abandoned tourist attraction into a personal fortress, a vantage point from which he could exercise both vigilance and control over the surrounding desert landscape, surveying the roads, settlements, and potential threats with the same precision that had characterized his years as a sniper in the NCR, yet now inflected by rage, paranoia, and a relentless need to assert some semblance of justice in a world that had stripped him of personal and professional certainty. Within this period, Boone's life became an intricate balancing act between the physical and psychological demands of survival, the moral imperative to prevent further injustices against innocents, and the obsessive drive to locate and punish those responsible for the disruption of his life, most notably the raiders who had abducted Carla, whose absence weighed upon him with a relentless intensity, fueling both his focus and his emotional torment. The dinosaur, colloquially referred to as the Dinky by locals, was emblematic of this transformation, a site of both isolation and empowerment, offering Boone a literal and figurative high ground from which he could project authority, maintain surveillance, and confront the Mojave on his own terms, reflecting the duality of his existence as a man simultaneously haunted and empowered by his past. Boone's behaviors during this period reveal a remarkable confluence of tactical discipline and psychological rigidity, as he meticulously organized his limited resources, fortified his position, and established a pattern of observation and reconnaissance designed to anticipate raider movements, NCR patrols, and any potential incursions that could further threaten his fragile hold on stability. His routines were obsessive in their precision, reflecting the intersection of military training, trauma response, and moral deliberation, as every movement was calculated not simply to ensure physical survival, but also to mitigate moral failure, prevent collateral harm, and preserve the ethical standards that had survived the Bitter Springs massacre. The psychological landscape of Boone's vigil in Novak illustrates the profound consequences of cumulative trauma, as the convergence of personal loss, institutional betrayal, and the brutal realities of the Mojave created a state of hypervigilance in which perception, judgment, and emotional regulation were inextricably linked, producing behaviors that were at once methodical, adaptive, and ethically charged, revealing the intricate ways in which grief and conscience could shape operational effectiveness, interpersonal interaction, and moral reasoning under extreme conditions. Within this context, Boone's relationships, or lack thereof, with the residents of Novak and the travelers who passed through the region provide insight into his internal struggle between the human need for connection and the compulsion to maintain control, distance, and autonomy. He engaged with outsiders selectively, assessing character, evaluating morality, and testing loyalty and ethical judgment, behaviors that reflected both a continuation of his military training and a coping mechanism designed to minimize the risk of further betrayal or moral compromise, revealing the interplay between trauma, ethical vigilance, and adaptive strategy. The Man in the Dinky period also underscores the thematic centrality of vengeance and moral reckoning in Boone's character, as the space he inhabited became a site of reflection, calculation, and preparation for eventual action, allowing him to contemplate the justice due for Carla's abduction, the failures of the NCR, and the broader moral injustices of the Mojave Wasteland. This period of intense introspection and methodical planning illustrates the narrative logic of Fallout New Vegas, where the personal and political, the ethical and tactical, are intertwined, and where the consequences of past trauma ripple outward to shape behavior, decisions, and interpersonal dynamics. Boone's prolonged vigil also illuminates the psychological effects of survivor's guilt, as he internalized responsibility for events beyond his control, particularly Bitter Springs and the loss of Carla, transforming the Dinky from a mere observation post into a psychological crucible in which he attempted to reconcile skill, morality, and emotional trauma, all while maintaining operational readiness, ethical focus, and the capacity for action. The meticulous routines he established, the constant surveillance, and the intense mental rehearsals of possible interventions reveal the depth of his cognitive engagement with both his own limitations and the moral imperatives he had adopted, reflecting a man whose identity was inseparable from both his past and the ethical principles that defined him. Canonically, this period serves to illustrate not merely the consequences of loss and trauma, but the ways in which moral agency persists, even under extreme duress, as Boone's actions, deliberations, and decisions during his time in the Dinky demonstrate the negotiation between ethical imperatives, personal vengeance, and the practical realities of survival, a synthesis that underscores the enduring tension between conscience and necessity in the Fallout universe, and illuminates Boone as a character who embodies the challenges of maintaining humanity, ethical integrity, and operational effectiveness in a post-apocalyptic world. In essence, The Man in the Dinghy is a study of the psychological, moral, and tactical dimensions of a man forced into isolation by loss and circumstance, reflecting the cumulative consequences of prior trauma, the moral ambiguities of military service, and the personal quest for justice and redemption. It is within this period that Boone crystallizes into the figure that players encounter in Novak, a sniper whose lethal skill is inseparable from ethical reflection, whose vigilance is motivated by both grief and conscience, and whose presence in the Mojave Wasteland is emblematic of the ongoing struggle to reconcile past tragedy with the imperative for action, justice, and the protection of those who remain, a portrait that combines tactical acumen, moral rigor, and profound human vulnerability in a single, deeply realized character. The arrival of the Courier in Novak represents a turning point in the life of Craig Boone, a moment in which the convergence of personal trauma, moral vigilance, and the opportunity for ethical engagement intersected to create the conditions for potential redemption, a narrative fulcrum through which players in Fallout, New Vegas encounter not merely a skilled sniper, but a man whose conscience, grief, and moral rigor define his every action and judgment. Boone's initial interactions with the Courier are characterized by caution, measured observation, and rigorous assessment of character, as he subjects this outsider to tests of ethical reasoning, competence, and loyalty, behaviors that reflect the cumulative effects of his prior experiences, including the trauma of Bitter Springs, the loss of Carla, and his long period of isolation in the Dinghy, and that reveal the intricate ways in which personal suffering shapes one's approach to trust, morality, and human connection. Boone's evaluation of the Courier is not limited to superficial measures of skill or reliability, but extends into the realm of ethical philosophy, as he probes the moral decisions of the player character, weighing actions taken against Raider factions, NCR soldiers, and members of Caesar's Legion, as well as the broader consequences of violence and intervention, illustrating the depth of his own ethical framework and the importance he places on conscientious decision-making. These interactions provide the player with a window into Boone's worldview, revealing a man for whom justice, responsibility, and accountability are inseparable from tactical effectiveness and operational decision-making, a soldier whose lethal precision is inseparable from the moral weight of his choices and the historical trauma that informs them. The scope of redemption in Boone's narrative is therefore mediated through the Courier's capacity to demonstrate ethical integrity, empathy, and alignment with the moral principles Boone has developed in response to his experiences, offering the player the opportunity to influence his trajectory from one of obsessive vengeance and isolation to one in which he might reclaim a measure of peace, moral clarity, and purpose. The potential for redemption is contingent, however, on the recognition of the consequences of past actions, the affirmation of ethical responsibility, and the ability to navigate the complex moral landscape of the Mojave, underscoring the interactive and morally consequential nature of Fallout New Vegas's narrative design. Boone's engagement with the Courier further highlights the tension between loyalty to institutional authority and fidelity to personal ethics, as he assesses whether the player's actions align with principles of justice and conscience, or merely replicate the moral compromises that he has sought to reject since Bitter Springs and the disappearance of Carla, reflecting the narrative and philosophical depth of his character, as well as the ways in which personal history, trauma, and moral reflection inform judgments of others in both interpersonal and broader societal contexts. The canonical significance of Boone's interactions with the Courier also extends to the exploration of trust, mentorship, and moral accountability, as he oscillates between guarded skepticism and cautious openness, testing not only the player's competence in combat and strategy, but also their capacity for ethical deliberation, human empathy, and adherence to principles that transcend immediate expediency, behaviors that mirror the tests he has applied to himself and his own actions throughout his life and military career, and that position him as a character whose development is inseparable from the ethical and psychological challenges presented by the Mojave Wasteland. Within this period, Boone's potential for redemption is articulated through both dialogue and action, as players are presented with opportunities to intervene in his quest for justice, influence his decisions regarding raiders, NCR conflicts, and Legion threats, and validate or challenge the moral frameworks that have emerged from his cumulative experiences. The narrative design ensures that redemption is neither automatic nor guaranteed, but contingent upon a nuanced engagement with Boone's ethical reasoning, a recognition of his grief and trauma, and the demonstration of alignment with the principles he values most, providing a layered and interactive exploration of morality, agency, and consequence within the Fallout universe. Boone's interaction with the Courier therefore exemplifies the intersection of personal and moral redemption, illustrating how trauma, loss, and ethical rigor shape a character's receptivity to influence, guidance, and reconciliation, and providing a narrative mechanism through which players can engage with the weight of conscience, the imperatives of justice, and the possibility of moral restoration in a world defined by scarcity, violence, and complex social and political dynamics. By positioning the Courier as both interlocutor and catalyst, Boone's narrative arc illuminates the broader philosophical themes of Fallout, New Vegas, including the negotiation between ethical ideals and practical realities, the consequences of past actions, and the capacity for agency and redemption even in a landscape marked by chaos and moral ambiguity. Through this lens, Boone emerges not merely as a skilled marksman or survivor, but as a profoundly human figure whose ethical engagement with others provides insight into the costs of war, the weight of conscience, and the possibility of moral restoration, reflecting the broader existential and ethical concerns that underpin the narrative universe of the Mojave Wasteland. Ultimately, the scope of redemption offered through Boone's interaction with the Courier underscores the enduring tension between vengeance and moral responsibility, grief and ethical clarity, and personal desire, and the obligation to act with justice, a tension that defines not only his character, but also the interactive moral universe of Fallout New Vegas, demonstrating that redemption is a process contingent upon reflection, deliberate choice, and the affirmation of conscience, and positioning Boone as a canonical figure whose story embodies the consequences of trauma, the pursuit of justice, and the potential for ethical reconciliation within a post-apocalyptic world. Craig Boone's worldview, shaped by a combination of personal trauma, military discipline, and ethical reflection, finds its fullest expression when examining the moral landscape of the Mojave Wasteland, a complex environment in which survival, loyalty, justice, and retribution intersect with the fragmented social, political, and ethical realities of post-apocalyptic life. Boone's perspective is not merely that of a soldier or a sniper, but of an individual whose conscience has been indelibly marked by the massacre at Bitter Springs, the abduction of his wife Carla, and the broader failures of the new California Republic to uphold its own professed ideals, experiences which collectively produce a nuanced lens through which he evaluates factions, human behavior, and the ethical calculus of violence and intervention. Boone's judgment of the Mojave's key players, including Caesar's Legion, the NCR, and independent communities, is informed by both tactical observation and moral evaluation, as he consistently weighs the potential human cost of actions against the broader strategic objectives, an approach that reflects his deep commitment to ensuring that lethal force, when applied, is guided by conscience and purpose, rather than expedience or institutional convenience. In this sense, Boone exemplifies a moral philosophy, rooted in accountability, foresight, and ethical deliberation, one that contrasts sharply with the often short-sighted, brutal, or self-serving calculations of those who wield power in the Mojave. His perspective on Caesar's Legion, in particular, is shaped by first-hand encounters with their atrocities and systemic cruelty, producing a visceral and enduring hatred that colors both his tactical decisions and his moral evaluations. Yet this hatred is tempered by the recognition that vengeance and moral clarity are not synonymous, requiring a careful balance between the desire to punish evil and the necessity of maintaining ethical integrity in one's actions, a tension that underscores the philosophical depth of Boone's worldview and his capacity for reflective judgment in morally ambiguous contexts. Boone's assessment of the NCR, meanwhile, reflects the complexity of loyalty when confronted with institutional imperfection. While he remains a committed soldier, in principle, his experiences at Bitter Springs and subsequent periods of disillusionment reveal the shortcomings, corruption, and moral compromises within the Republic, leading him to adopt a critical stance toward orders, campaigns, and the enforcement of policy, evaluating each in terms of its alignment with ethical principles and the minimization of unnecessary harm. This careful, conscientious scrutiny exemplifies his internalization of moral responsibility and his insistence that loyalty must not come at the cost of conscience or human life. In addition to the major factions, Boone's understanding of the Mojave moral landscape encompasses smaller, decentralized actors, such as raider bands, mercenary groups, and isolated settlements, whose behavior is often dictated by survival imperatives, historical grievances, and opportunistic motivations, forcing him to continually reassess the ethical implications of engagement, the prioritization of threats, and the proportionality of his responses. This constant navigation of ambiguity reinforces his moral vigilance and shapes the criteria by which he evaluates both enemies and allies, creating a framework in which ethical reasoning is inseparable from tactical decision-making and survival strategy. Boone's reflections also extend to the philosophical weight of righteous killing, a concept that embodies both the necessity and the ethical complexity of lethal action in a lawless and morally fractured world. For Boone, the act of killing is never undertaken lightly, and each shot is measured not only for tactical efficacy, but for ethical justification, requiring an ongoing negotiation between the imperative to protect, the obligation to uphold justice, and the recognition of one's own fallibility, a process that illuminates the broader ethical concerns of Fallout New Vegas and situates Boone as a character whose conscience is as active and consequential as his trigger finger. The moral landscape Boone navigates is further complicated by the practical realities of post-apocalyptic existence, including resource scarcity, environmental hazards, and the constant threat of unpredictable violence. which demand an integration of ethical reflection with strategic foresight, adaptability, and calculated risk. Boone's ability to synthesize these dimensions of moral, tactical, and psychological reasoning exemplifies the depth of his character and the complexity of navigating the Mojave, highlighting the intricate interplay between personal ethics, social responsibility, and survival imperatives. Canonically, Boone's perspective offers insight into the interplay between human agency and systemic structures in the Mojave, as he negotiates the space between obedience to orders, allegiance to the NCR, and personal moral accountability, evaluating every encounter, alliance, and engagement through the lens of conscience and ethical foresight. This approach positions him as both participant and observer in the Mojave, a figure whose moral deliberations shape his tactical decisions, interactions with the Courier, and responses to the persistent challenges of the post-apocalyptic environment. Ultimately, Boone's moral landscape is defined by an enduring commitment to justice, accountability, and the careful application of force, a worldview forged in the crucible of trauma, loss, and ethical reflection, and enacted through the precise, disciplined, and conscientious use of his skills as a sniper and soldier. His understanding of the Mojave is both strategic and philosophical, encompassing the realities of factional politics, human frailty, and the ethical dilemmas that arise from a world in which law, morality, and survival frequently collide. Boone's perspective demonstrates the delicate balance between moral idealism and practical necessity, as he continuously evaluates the implications of action and inaction, weighing human costs, ethical responsibility, and strategic effectiveness in every encounter. It is this synthesis of moral philosophy, tactical acumen, and psychological insight that defines Boone as a character and provides players with a rich lens through which to explore the ethical dimensions of post-apocalyptic life, highlighting the ways in which trauma, conscience, and lived experience shape judgments, behavior, and the potential for both redemption and moral compromise in the Mojave Wasteland. In sum, Boone's navigation of the Mojave's moral terrain illuminates the complexity of ethical decision-making in a fractured world, offering a canonical exploration of justice, loyalty, and the philosophical weight of violence, while situating him as a morally conscious agent whose worldview, tempered by loss and trauma, challenges players to consider the consequences of action, the demands of conscience, and the intricate interplay of morality, survival, and duty in the harsh realities of post-apocalyptic existence, a testament to both the depth of his character and the narrative sophistication of New Vegas. The shadow of Caesar's legion looms over Craig Boone's life, as both a soldier and a man, representing not only a strategic adversary in the Mojave Wasteland, but also a persistent moral and psychological challenge that amplifies the trauma, grief, and ethical vigilance cultivated over years of service and personal loss. Boone's encounters with the Legion are informed by both direct and indirect experiences, including the violence and atrocities perpetrated against civilians and combatants alike, which serve to crystallize his understanding of the stakes involved in post-apocalyptic conflict and the profound consequences of unchecked brutality, a lesson reinforced by his prior exposure to institutional failures at Bitter Springs, and the ethical compromises of NCR military operations, all of which converge to create a lens of moral clarity, tactical precision, and visceral hatred for the Legion's authoritarian, dehumanizing methods. Boone's engagement with the Legion is not merely physical or tactical. but also deeply psychological, as he internalizes the moral imperative to resist oppression, protect innocence, and prevent further atrocities, an imperative that manifests in both his sniper operations and his broader ethical calculations, shaping his responses to threats, alliances, and strategic decisions throughout the Mojave. Every encounter with Legion forces is filtered through a dual lens of operational risk assessment and ethical reflection, demonstrating the inseparability of his lethal skill from the moral framework that governs its application. Canonically, Boone's hatred of the Legion is rooted in first-hand observation of their systemic cruelty, including the ritualized executions, sexual slavery, and coercive tactics employed to consolidate power and instill terror, events which echo the personal trauma he has experienced and reinforce the urgency of his moral mission, a mission in which vengeance, justice, and ethical responsibility are intertwined. His response to the Legion is therefore both visceral and disciplined, reflecting the synthesis of personal grief, professional training, and moral deliberation, and exemplifying a character whose ethical consciousness informs tactical decision-making even in the face of extreme threat. Boone's strategies against the Legion are informed by both reconnaissance and ethical prudence, as he evaluates the proportionality of force, the protection of non-combatants, and the broader consequences of each action, seeking to balance the imperatives of survival, justice, and ethical integrity within a morally ambiguous landscape where the lines between enemy, victim, and bystander are often obscured by circumstance and necessity. This careful calibration of moral and operational judgment underscores the depth of his psychological and ethical sophistication, as well as the degree to which trauma and moral reflection shape his engagement with the world around him. The shadow of the Legion also serves as a narrative device that illuminates the enduring impact of systemic evil on individual conscience, as Boone's intense focus on their atrocities mirrors his own internal struggle with guilt, responsibility, and the limits of ethical action, a reflection of the broader thematic concerns of Fallout New Vegas regarding the costs of war, the exercise of power, and the ethical responsibilities of those capable of exerting force in defense of justice. Boone becomes both observer and participant in this moral calculus, embodying the tension between righteous action and personal trauma that defines his character. Boone's response to the Legion is further complicated by the interplay between institutional loyalty and personal ethics, as his alignment with the NCR is continually tested by the Republic's failures to prevent atrocities, protect innocence, or exercise moral restraint, leading him to evaluate not only the actions of the Legion, but also the efficacy and morality of his own organization, a perspective that reinforces his ethical vigilance and heightens the stakes of each engagement, illustrating the intricate interconnection between personal conscience, institutional accountability, and tactical decision-making. In addition, Boone's encounters with Legion agents provide insight into the psychological mechanisms of control, fear, and coercion employed by authoritarian regimes, highlighting the ways in which systemic brutality exploits vulnerability, obedience, and the moral compromises of individuals, an understanding that informs Boone's strategic approach, tactical patience, and moral evaluation of potential courses of action. His responses reflect a combination of experiential knowledge, ethical reflection, and survival pragmatism, emphasizing the depth of his character as a soldier whose conscience is as active and consequential as his sniper's sight. The Legion's shadow thus operates on multiple levels: tactical, as a formidable adversary requiring precision and strategy, psychological, as a trigger for grief, rage, and moral reflection, and ethical, as a constant test of the principles Boone has developed in response to past trauma, loss, and the ethical compromises he has witnessed in military service. It is within this confluence of influences that Boone's character is defined, a man whose lethal capability is inseparable from moral deliberation, and whose hatred of systemic evil is both deeply personal and universally comprehensible. Boone's narrative arc, in relation to the Legion, also emphasizes the interactive and moral dimensions of the Fallout New Vegas experience, as players encountering Boone are invited to understand, reflect upon, and even influence his judgments, strategic choices, and ethical stance, revealing a character whose worldview is not static but responsive to both external stimuli and the moral choices of others, and whose engagement with the Mojave's dangers is inseparable from the ethical framework through which he interprets and acts upon those threats. Ultimately, the Legion's shadow illuminates the cumulative effects of trauma, loss, and moral vigilance in shaping Boone's psyche and ethical philosophy, demonstrating how repeated exposure to cruelty, injustice, and institutional failure produces a character who combines lethal skill with conscience, strategic intelligence with moral reflection, and personal grief with a relentless commitment to justice, establishing Boone as one of the most psychologically and morally complex figures in the Mojave, whose narrative resonates as a profound study of the interplay between ethical responsibility, personal trauma, and the unrelenting demands of survival in a morally fractured world. The Red Beret, worn by Craig Boone throughout his service in the New California Republic Army and into his vigil in the Mojave Wasteland, serves not merely as a piece of military attire, but as a complex symbol of identity, discipline, personal history, and enduring loss, reflecting the interplay between professional pride, ethical responsibility, and the personal traumas that have defined his life. Canonically, the Red Beret is emblematic of Boone's tenure as a sniper, marking him as a soldier trained in precision, patience, and lethality, qualities that were honed through rigorous training, repeated exposure to combat, and the ethical reflection that emerged in response to both the structural failures of the NCR and the personal tragedies he experienced, including the Bitter Springs massacre and the abduction of his wife, Carla, a dual narrative of professional achievement and moral burden that transforms the beret into a symbol of both competence and conscience. In his post-Bitter Springs life, the beret functions as a tangible reminder of the man he once was and the ideals he once believed the NCR embodied, a visual marker of his commitment to duty, skill, and precision, even as he struggled with disillusionment, grief, and an evolving understanding of morality in a world where institutions frequently fail to uphold justice or protect the innocent. In this sense, the Red Beret represents both the continuity of identity and the dissonance between institutional loyalty and personal conscience, a duality that permeates Boone's narrative and informs the way players perceive him within Fallout New Vegas. The Red Beret's significance extends beyond its military symbolism to encompass deeply personal meanings, serving as a locus for memory, reflection, and emotional anchoring, connecting Boone to the experiences, responsibilities, and losses that have shaped him, particularly his life with Carla Boone and the consequences of her abduction, which elevated his grief into a moral imperative to act, observe, and maintain vigilance in the Mojave Wasteland. It functions simultaneously as a badge of honor, a tool of identification, and a constant reminder of the ethical and emotional weight that accompanies skill in both war and peace, illustrating the inseparability of Boone's professional and personal identities. The beret also operates as a narrative device within the broader Fallout canon, symbolizing not only Boone's expertise and loyalty, but also the psychological and ethical consequences of trauma, as its presence reinforces the player's awareness of the tension between past experiences, present behavior, and future choices, highlighting the ways in which objects of personal significance in the Mojave often carry layered meanings that extend beyond functionality into the realms of memory, identity, and moral reflection. Boone's attachment to the beret and its constant presence on his person thus communicates both resilience, mourning, an emblem of human continuity amidst dislocation and loss. Furthermore, the red beret encapsulates the intersection of ethics and efficacy, serving as a metaphor for Boone's philosophy of righteous killing and conscientious combat, wherein the discipline and precision symbolized by the beret are inseparable from the ethical frameworks that guide the use of lethal force. Each engagement he undertakes is informed by the dual demands of professional skill and moral accountability, and the beret functions as a tangible reminder of this responsibility, linking the external visual symbol to the internal moral and psychological imperatives that define his character. In social and narrative terms, the red beret distinguishes Boone within the Mojave landscape, signaling to allies, enemies, and the Courier alike that he is a figure shaped by experience, trauma, and ethical consciousness, a visual shorthand for competence, moral vigilance, and personal history that communicates the layers of narrative meaning embedded in his character, from his formative years in the NCR Army to his solitary vigil in Novak and his cautious engagement with the Courier. The beret's symbolic resonance is reinforced by Boone's disciplined demeanor, deliberate speech, and careful observation, creating a coherent and compelling portrait of a man whose professional and personal identities are tightly interwoven. The canonical significance of the red beret is further amplified by its role as a marker of Boone's connection to a world both structured and chaotic, representing the dualities of order and disorder, loyalty and disillusionment, action and reflection that permeate his story. It becomes a lens through which to understand his meticulous attention to detail, his moral reasoning, and the tension between past ideals and present realities, illustrating the ways in which personal artifacts in the Fallout universe carry symbolic, ethical, and psychological weight. In essence, the red beret embodies Boone's legacy, encompassing the technical mastery of his military training, the moral lessons learned through exposure to institutional failures and personal trauma, and the enduring human capacity for vigilance, reflection, and ethical engagement. It represents a life defined by both skill and conscience, a tangible artifact through which the complexities of duty, grief, justice, and identity are communicated to both the player and the wider narrative context of the Mojave, cementing Boone's position as a character whose depth, moral acuity, and human vulnerability are inseparable from his professional expertise, and the emblematic red beret that signals both his past and his continuing ethical struggle. The symbolism of the beret also intersects with broader themes of identity, legacy, and remembrance in the Fallout canon, serving as a testament to the way objects and attire are imbued with meaning through experience, choice, and consequence. In Boone's case, The red beret is not merely clothing, but a manifestation of the moral and psychological landscape he inhabits, a marker of the human cost of war, the discipline of military life, and the enduring presence of conscience and ethical vigilance in the post-apocalyptic world, illustrating the narrative sophistication with which Fallout intertwines character, artifact, and thematic resonance to create a compelling exploration of morality, identity, and human resilience. The intersection of Craig Boone's personal narrative with the player character, known as the Courier, represents one of the most morally and psychologically intricate points in Fallout New Vegas, a juncture in which the decisions of an external agent have the power to influence not only Boone's immediate actions, but also the trajectory of his ethical, emotional, and psychological arc, effectively making the player a participant in the negotiation between vengeance, justice, and redemption. Canonically, the Courier arrives in Novak at a moment when Boone is deeply entrenched in grief, survivor's guilt, and obsessive moral vigilance following the abduction of his wife Carla and the cumulative trauma of Bitter Springs. And the ensuing interactions are marked by tests, probes, and evaluations designed to determine whether the Courier's character aligns with the ethical framework Boone has cultivated over years of experience, reflection, and confrontation with human cruelty. The decisions faced by the Courier, ranging from dialogue options to strategic actions, function as both moral litmus tests and narrative catalysts, allowing Boone to assess the player's capacity for empathy, justice, and ethical judgment, a process that mirrors his own internal deliberations and underscores the canonical principle that moral clarity in the Mojave is contingent upon conscious choice, rather than institutional fiat. In this context, Boone's responses to the Courier reflect the same meticulous assessment, ethical calculation, and moral vigilance that define his engagements with Raiders, NCR factions, and Caesar's Legion, emphasizing the continuity of his character's principles regardless of the specific circumstances or the identities of those he interacts with. The potential outcomes of the Courier's choices illustrate the branching complexity of Boone's moral and psychological development, with pathways that can lead him toward redemption, exacerbate his obsession with vengeance, or entrench him in despair and alienation, demonstrating the interplay between personal agency, ethical influence, and trauma resolution within the interactive structure of the game. Boone's trajectory is thus dynamically responsive, his ethical and emotional state acting as both a mirror and a measure of the player's engagement with his moral universe, highlighting the delicate balance between guidance, intervention, and moral alignment in the shaping of post-apocalyptic human behavior. Boone's ethical reasoning, as revealed through these interactions, is characterized by a careful calibration of principles and pragmatism, with decisions evaluated according to both moral weight and practical consequence, reflecting his lifelong synthesis of tactical precision, ethical reflection, and moral accountability. The Courier's ability to demonstrate congruence with these standards becomes a critical determinant of Boone's trust, willingness to cooperate, and openness to reconciliation, illustrating how narrative design can integrate moral psychology and interactive agency to create deeply resonant character arcs. Canonically, the choices of the Courier extend beyond immediate consequences for Boone to influence broader ethical narratives in the Mojave, as alignment with or deviation from Boone's moral expectations can affect his stance toward factional conflicts, decisions to intervene in the suffering of innocents, and ultimate capacity to reconcile grief with action, highlighting the interdependence of personal trauma moral judgment, and relational influence in shaping both individual character and environmental outcomes within the Fallout universe. Furthermore, Boone's responses to the Courier's decisions underscore the enduring tension between vengeance and justice, personal grief and ethical responsibility, and past trauma and forward-looking moral deliberation, as each potential path reveals different facets of his character, one in which he achieves clarity, balance, and ethical restoration, another in which he becomes consumed by rage, alienation, and moral absolutism, and a third in which unresolved grief and distrust lead to tragic or self-destructive outcomes, illustrating the nuanced moral calculus at the heart of his narrative. The Courier thus functions as both participant and catalyst, shaping Boone's capacity for forgiveness, reconciliation, and moral reintegration into the world, while also illuminating the broader philosophical questions posed by the Mojave's fractured ethical landscape, including the limits of institutional authority, the consequences of moral compromise, and the human capacity to exercise conscience under conditions of scarcity, danger, and systemic violence. Boone's responses to these influences reveal the degree to which personal and relational dynamics intersect with broader ethical imperatives in post-apocalyptic life. In addition, the canonical structure of Boone's interactions with the Courier emphasizes the significance of trust, ethical alignment, and shared responsibility, as each choice made by the player can validate or challenge Boone's moral assumptions, affect his willingness to act in alignment with his ethical framework, and influence his psychological trajectory, demonstrating the interplay between agency, moral influence, and relational dynamics in the construction of character identity and narrative consequence within Fallout New Vegas. Ultimately, the Courier's choices operate as a lens through which the moral, psychological, and ethical dimensions of Boone's character are explored, offering a multifaceted examination of how trauma, conscience, grief, and relational trust converge to shape both immediate action and long-term moral orientation, positioning Boone as a canonical figure whose trajectory is dynamically responsive to the ethical engagement of others, and whose potential for redemption, vengeance, or despair is inseparable from the conscious decisions made in the moral and tactical crucible of the Mojave Wasteland. Through this interactive framework, Boone emerges not merely as a sniper or veteran of the NCR, but as a living ethical agent, a moral and psychological exemplar whose story illuminates the broader themes of Fallout, including the consequences of war, the weight of personal responsibility, and the profound impact of relational and ethical influence in shaping human behavior under conditions of extreme adversity, reinforcing his status as one of the most ethically complex and narratively compelling characters in the Mojave. Craig Boone's character in Fallout New Vegas serves as a profound embodiment of the ethical complexity that permeates the series, representing the tension between loyalty, moral conscience, and the human capacity to endure trauma while attempting to act justly in a world defined by scarcity, violence, and moral ambiguity. Through his experiences as a soldier in the new California Republic, his exposure to the atrocities of Bitter Springs, and the personal devastation wrought by the abduction of his wife Carla, Boone emerges as a canonical figure whose narrative is a living study of how individuals navigate the gray areas of post-apocalyptic ethics, weighing duty against conscience, institutional allegiance against personal morality, and vengeance against justice. thereby offering players a lens through which to examine the consequences of action and inaction in a morally fractured landscape. Boone's ethical symbolism is inseparable from his skill set and military background, as his precision as a sniper is married to a disciplined moral framework that governs the application of lethal force, reflecting the broader Fallout themes that interrogate the relationship between power, responsibility, and moral accountability. His decisions are never merely tactical, but are infused with considerations of right, wrong, and the human cost of violence, illustrating the series' insistence that moral reasoning is inseparable from survival in the post-apocalyptic context, and that ethical engagement is an active, ongoing process rather than a static attribute. Within this framework, Boone's character illuminates the consequences of institutional failure and the ethical dilemmas inherent in serving a flawed organization, as his disillusionment with the NCR following Bitter Springs demonstrates the difficulty of reconciling loyalty to an institution with personal conscience, a tension that underpins much of the moral inquiry in Fallout New Vegas. Boone's struggle to navigate this ethical landscape, balancing duty, morality, and personal responsibility, positions him as a symbol of the broader challenge faced by individuals in a world where structural corruption and human malevolence constantly test the limits of ethical behavior. Boone's grief over Carla's disappearance further amplifies his ethical resonance, as it transforms personal trauma into a moral lens through which he interprets the world, guiding his actions, judgments, and strategic decisions. The ethical weight of his grief manifests in both his obsessive vigilance and his conscientious evaluation of others' moral integrity, reflecting the canonical depiction of how trauma can heighten moral sensitivity and sharpen the discernment of justice and wrongdoing, even as it risks tipping the individual toward obsession, vengeance, or moral rigidity. Moreover, Boone's ethical symbolism is reinforced through his interactions with the Courier, whose choices directly influence the trajectory of his moral and emotional arc, illustrating the series' interactive engagement with ethics and the ways in which relational dynamics and player agency shape character development. Through these interactions, Boone functions as a moral mirror, reflecting the player's choices and providing insight into the ethical principles that govern conscientious action in a world where law, order, and morality are unstable and often contested. The canon further emphasizes Boone as a representation of the moral costs of war and the weight of personal responsibility, as his experiences demonstrate the enduring consequences of actions taken in service to flawed institutions, the psychological toll of exposure to atrocities, and the ethical imperative to weigh each decision with care, even in circumstances where expediency or survival might encourage compromise. In this sense, Boone exemplifies the central ethical question of Fallout. How can individuals navigate morally gray circumstances while retaining integrity, humanity, and the capacity for moral reflection? Boone's life, defined by service, loss, and conscientious ethical engagement, also symbolizes the tension between personal morality and systemic structures, highlighting the series' thematic preoccupation with the limits of institutional authority and the capacity for individuals to act justly when those structures fail. His trajectory illustrates how moral clarity is achieved not through obedience alone, but through deliberate, reflective, and ethically guided action, reinforcing his status as a symbol of principled agency within a morally ambiguous world. The Red Beret, the Vigil in the Dinky, and his careful assessment of factions such as Caesar's Legion and the NCR serve as tangible manifestations of this ethical symbolism, marking Boone as a character whose identity, choices, and skills are inseparable from his moral reasoning and conscientious engagement with the ethical challenges of the Mojave. Through these narrative devices, the canon emphasizes that ethical conduct in Fallout is both performative and internal, reflected in action, observation, and moral deliberation, and that characters like Boone serve as exemplars of how personal virtue, professional skill, and moral vigilance can coexist, even under extreme duress. Boone's narrative also engages with the broader thematic exploration of justice versus revenge, illustrating the ethical complexity of vengeance in a morally fractured world. While his grief and anger over Carla's abduction create the potential for morally compromising action, his conscience, training, and reflective ethical reasoning temper these impulses, demonstrating that adherence to principle is not incompatible with strong emotional motivation, and that the measure of ethical action is found in the balance between human feeling and moral judgment. In sum, Craig Boone functions as a living symbol of Fallout's ethical inquiry, embodying the consequences of institutional failure, the moral weight of personal trauma, the interplay between duty and conscience, and the challenge of maintaining integrity in a world defined by scarcity, violence, and moral ambiguity. Through his character, players are invited to explore questions of justice, responsibility, and ethical agency, to confront the consequences of action and inaction, and to understand that moral engagement is a dynamic, relational, and deeply human process, a testament to the series' commitment to complex storytelling, interactive moral exploration, and the portrayal of characters whose humanity is inseparable from their ethical reasoning and personal history, with Boone standing as one of the most compelling embodiments of these themes in the Mojave Wasteland. Craig Boone's legacy within the Mojave Wasteland and the broader Fallout mythos is encapsulated in the moniker "The Man Who Never Missed," a designation that signifies not merely his unparalleled skill as a marksman, but the depth integration of technical proficiency, moral consciousness, and psychological complexity that defines his canonical presence, illustrating the series' exploration of the human capacity for precision, accountability, and ethical engagement in a world shaped by scarcity, violence, and moral ambiguity. This title, while superficially celebratory of military achievement, is laden with the gravitas of personal loss, ethical deliberation, and the enduring consequences of trauma, marking Boone as a figure whose lethal skill is inseparable from his conscientious reflection, ethical rigor, and the emotional burdens that have shaped his decisions, relationships, and trajectory within the Mojave. Boone's reputation as the man who never missed is inseparable from his history in the New California Republic Army, where his years of sniper training, operational experience, and battlefield discipline cultivated not only technical mastery, but also the capacity for moral deliberation under conditions of extreme pressure, a duality that characterizes his interactions with raiders, NCR forces, Caesar's Legion, and civilians alike, and which underscores the canonical principle that skill devoid of conscience is incomplete, while moral clarity without competence is ineffectual. Boone embodies the synthesis of both, illustrating the narrative and philosophical sophistication with which Fallout constructs characters whose abilities are inseparable from ethical reasoning and human vulnerability. Canonically, this legacy is amplified through Boone's personal experiences, most notably the Bitter Springs massacre and the abduction of his wife, Carla. events that transform his skill from mere technical proficiency into a tool for ethical vigilance, protective action, and the pursuit of justice. The stakes of each shot, each calculated engagement, are elevated by the moral and emotional weight he carries, demonstrating that mastery of the rifle is not an end in itself, but a means of reconciling grief, maintaining ethical integrity, and confronting the moral failings of a fractured world, a thematic through-line that resonates throughout his narrative arc. Boone's interactions with the Courier further illuminate his legacy, as the player's choices can either reinforce his potential for redemption, guide him toward measured justice, or inadvertently deepen his path toward vengeance and despair, emphasizing the relational dimension of his moral and tactical identity and reinforcing the canonical depiction of Boone as a man whose humanity, skill, and ethical framework are intertwined, responsive, and shaped by both personal history and the actions of those he trusts. This interactive dimension renders him a living embodiment of Fallout's moral philosophy, illustrating the consequences of agency, accountability, and relational influence in shaping ethical outcomes in a post-apocalyptic environment. The moniker, "The Man Who Never Missed," also operates symbolically, representing the convergence of precision, vigilance, and moral acuity, a triad that positions Boone as an exemplar of disciplined conscience within the Mojave, a figure whose ethical reasoning is as integral to his identity as his capacity to strike with unerring accuracy. It encapsulates the narrative arc that spans his upbringing in NCR territory, military service, exposure to atrocities, personal loss, and eventual moral confrontation with the Mojave's complex ethical landscape, demonstrating how skill, grief, and conscience coalesce to produce a character of profound narrative, psychological, and ethical resonance. Furthermore, Boone's legacy underscores the tension between public perception and private struggle, as the mythos of never missing is tempered by the internal realities of trauma, grief, and ethical deliberation, revealing the human dimension behind legendary competence and emphasizing the series' commitment to nuanced, morally textured character development. The legend of Boone's marksmanship is inseparable from the story of a man navigating loss, conscience, and the moral ambiguities of survival, reflecting the broader thematic concerns of Fallout regarding the consequences of war, the demands of ethical vigilance, and the human cost of skill deployed in morally complex circumstances. Canonically, Boone's enduring significance is further reinforced by his symbolic function as a touchstone for ethical inquiry within the narrative, offering players a lens through which to explore the implications of loyalty, vengeance, conscience, and redemption in a world defined by instability, scarcity, and ethical complexity. His story provides a model for the careful calibration of moral judgment, the integration of skill and conscience, and the navigation of personal and systemic failures, illustrating that ethical integrity is not merely a theoretical principle, but an active, lived process that shapes action, relationships, and legacy. In sum, The Man Who Never Missed encapsulates the totality of Craig Boone's canonical narrative, combining technical mastery, ethical vigilance, personal trauma, and relational engagement into a singularly compelling character study, a figure whose story illuminates the human capacity for precision, reflection, and moral courage in a world where every action carries consequences and every choice reverberates across the landscape of survival, justice, and conscience. Boone's tragedy, perseverance, and moral rigor coalesce into a narrative that is both instructive and emblematic, offering players a profound meditation on the costs and responsibilities of human agency, the possibility of redemption, and the enduring struggle to reconcile skill, grief, and conscience within the unforgiving expanse of the Mojave Wasteland, cementing his place as one of the most ethically resonant and psychologically compelling characters in the Fallout series.